A Sign in Space by Italo Calvino from the book Cosmicomics. Situated in the external zone of the Milky Way, the Sun takes about 200 million years to make a complete revolution of the galaxy. Right, that's how long it takes, not a day less. Kufk said. Once, as I went past, I drew a sign at a point in space just so I could find it again 200 million years later when we went by the next time around. What sort of sign? It's hard to explain, because if I say sign to you, you immediately think of something that can be distinguished from a something else. But nothing could be distinguished from anything there. You immediately think of a sign made with some implement or with your hands, and then, when you take the implement or your hands away, the sign remains. But in those days, there were no implements, or even hands, or teeth, or noses, all things that came along afterwards, a long time afterwards. As to the form a sign should have, you say it's no problem because whatever form it may be given, a sign has to serve as a sign. That is, be different or else the same as other signs. Here again, it's easy for you young ones to talk. But in that period, I didn't have any examples to follow. I couldn't say, I'll make it the same or I'll make it different. There were no things to copy. Nobody knew what a line was. Straight or curved, or even a dot, or a protuberance, or a cavity. I conceived the idea of making a sign, that's true enough, or rather, I conceived the idea of considering a sign a something that I felt like making. So when, at that point in space and not in another, I made something, meaning to make a sign, it turned out that I really had made a sign after all. In other words, considering it was the first sign ever made in the universe, or at least in the circuit of the Milky Way, I must admit it came out very well. Visible? What a question! Who had eyes to see with in those days? Nothing had ever been seen by anything. The question never even arose. Recognizable, yes, beyond any possibility of error, because all the other points in space were the same, indistinguishable. And instead, this one had the sign on it. So, as the planets continued their revolutions and the solar system went on in its own, I soon left the sign far behind me, separated from it by the endless fields of space, and I couldn't help thinking about when I would come back and encounter it again, and how I would know it, and how happy it would make me in that anonymous expanse after I had spent 100,000 light years without meeting anything familiar. Nothing for hundreds of centuries, for thousands of millennia. I'd come back, and there it would be in its place, just as I had left it, simple and bare, but with that unmistakable imprint, so to speak, that I had given it. Slowly, the Milky Way revolved, with its fringe of constellations and planets and clouds, and the sun along with the rest, toward the edge. In all that circling, only the sign remained still, in an ordinary spot, out of all the orbit's reach. To make it, I leaned over the border of the galaxy a little, so it would remain outside, and all those revolving worlds wouldn't crash into it. In an ordinary point that was no longer ordinary, since it was the only point that was surely there, and which could be used as a reference point to distinguish other points. I thought about it day and night. In fact, I couldn't think about anything else. Actually, this was the first opportunity I had to think of something, or I should say, to think something had never been possible. First, because there were no things to think about, and second, because signs to think of them by were lacking. But from the moment there was that sign, it was possible for someone thinking to think of a sign, and therefore that one. In the sense that the sign was the thing you could think about, and also the sign of the thing thought, namely itself. So, The situation was this. The sign served to mark a place, but at the same time it meant that in that place there was a sign, something far more important because there were plenty of places, but there was only one sign. And also, at the same time, that sign was mine, the sign of me, because it was the only sign I had ever made. And I was the only one who had ever made signs. It was like a name, the name of that point, and also my name that I had signed on that spot. In short, it was the only thing available for everything that required a name. Transported by the sides of the galaxy, our world went navigating through distant spaces, and the sign stayed where I had left it to mark that spot. And at the same time, it marked me. I carried it with me. It inhabited me, possessed me entirely, came between me and everything with which I might have attempted to establish a relationship. As I waited to come back and meet it again, I could try to derive other signs from it, and combination of signs. Series of similar signs and contrasts of different signs, but already tens and tens of thousands of millennia had gone by since the moment when I had made it. Rather, since the few seconds in which I had scrolled it down in the constant movement of the Milky Way. And now, just when I needed to bear in mind its every detail, the slightest uncertainty about its form made uncertain the possible distinctions between it and other signs I might make, I realized that, though I recalled its general outline, its overall appearance, still something about it eluded me. I mean, if I tried to break it down into its various elements, I couldn't remember whether between one part and the other it went like this or like that. I needed it there in front of me to study, to consult, but instead it was still far away. I didn't yet know how far because I had made it precisely in order to know the time it would take me to see it again, and until I had found it once more, I wouldn't know. Now, however, it wasn't my motive in making it that mattered to me, but how it was made, and I started inventing hypotheses about this how, and theories according to which a certain sign had to be perforce in a certain way, or else, proceeding by exclusion, I tried to eliminate all the less probable types of sign to arrive at the right one. But all these imaginary signs vanished inevitably because that first sign was missing as a term of comparison. As I racked my brain like this while the galaxy went on turning wakefully in its bed of soft emptiness and the atoms burned and radiated, I realized I had lost by now even that confused notion of my sign, and I succeeded in conceiving only interchangeable fragments of signs, that is, smaller signs within the large one, and every change of these signs within the sign changed the sign itself into a completely different one. In short, I had completely forgotten what my sign was like, and, try as I might, it wouldn't come back to my mind. Did I despair? No. This forgetfulness was annoying, but not irreparable. Whatever happened, I knew the sign was there waiting for me, quiet and still. I would arrive, I would find it again, and I would then be able to pick up the thread of my meditations. At a rough guess, I calculated we had completed half of our galactic revolution. I had only to be patient. The second half always seemed to go by more quickly. Now I just had to remember the sign existed, and I would pass it again. Day followed day, and then I knew I must be near. I was furiously impatient because I might encounter the sign at any moment. It's here, no, a little farther on. Now I'll count up to 100. Had it disappeared? Had we already gone past it? I didn't know. My sign had perhaps remained, who knows where, behind, completely remote from the revolutionary orbit of our system. I hadn't calculated the oscillations to which, especially in those days, the celestial bodies' fields of gravity were subject, and which caused them to trace irregular orbits. Cut like the flower of a dahlia. For about 100 millennia, I tormented myself, going over my calculations. It turned out that our course touched that spot not every galactic year, but only every 3, that is, every 600 million solar years. When you've waited 200 million years, you can also wait 600, and I waited. The way was long, but I wasn't on foot after all. Astride the galaxy, I traveled through the light years, galloping over the planetary and stellar orbits as if I were on a horse whose shoes struck sparks. I was in a state of mounting excitement. I felt I was going forth to conquer the only thing that mattered to me: sign and dominion and name. I made the 2nd circuit, the 3rd. I was there. I let out a yell. At a point which had to be that very point, in the place of my sign, there was a shapeless scratch, a bruised, chipped abrasion of space. I had lost everything: the sign, the point, the thing that caused me, being the one who had made the sign at that point, to be me. Space without a sign was once again a chasm, the void without beginning or end, nauseating, in which everything, including me, was lost. And don't come telling me that to fix a point of my sign and the erasure of my sign amounted to the same thing. The erasure was the negation of the sign, and therefore didn't serve to distinguish one point from the preceding and successive points. I was disheartened, and for many light years I let myself be dragged along as if I were unconscious. When I finally raised my eyes, in the meanwhile, sight had begun in our world, and as a result, also life. I saw what I would never have expected to see. I saw it. The sign, but not that one. A similar sign, a sign unquestionably copied from mine, but one I realized immediately couldn't be mine. It was so squat and careless and clumsily pretentious, a wretched counterfeit of what I had meant to indicate with that sign, whose ineffable purity I could only now through contrast recapture. Who had played this trick on me? I couldn't figure it out. Finally, a plural millennial chain of deductions led me to the solution. On another planetary system, which performed its galactic revolution before us, there was a certain Quig, the name I deduced afterwards in the later era of names. A spiteful type, consumed with envy, who had erased my sign in a vandalistic impulse and then, with vulgar artifice, had attempted to make another. It was clear that his sign had nothing to mark except Quig's intention to imitate my sign, which was beyond all comparison. But at that moment, the determination not to let my rival get the better of me was stronger than any other desire. I wanted immediately to make a new sign in space, a real sign that would make Quig die of envy. About 700 millions of years had gone by since I had first tried to make a sign, but I fell to work with a will. Now things were different, however, because the world, as I mentioned, was beginning to produce an image of itself, and in everything a form was beginning to correspond to a function, and the forms of that time, we believed, had a long future ahead of them. Instead, we were wrong. Take, to give you a fairly recent example, the dinosaurs. And therefore, in this new sign of mine, you could perceive the influence of our new way of looking at things. Call it style, if you like, that special way that everything had to be there in a certain fashion. I must say I was truly satisfied with it, and I no longer regretted that first sign that had been erased, because this one seemed vastly more beautiful to me. But in the duration of that galactic year, we already began to realize that the world's forms had been temporary up until then, and that they would change one by one. and this awareness was accompanied by a certain annoyance with the old images, so that even their memory was intolerable. I began to be tormented by a thought. I had left that sign in space, that sign which had seemed so beautiful and original to me, and so suited to its function, and which now, in my memory, seemed inappropriate in all its pretension, a sign chiefly of an antiquated way of conceiving signs and of my foolish acceptance of an order of things I ought to have been wise enough to break away from in time. In other words, I was ashamed of that sign, which went on through the centuries, being passed by worlds in flight, making a ridiculous spectacle of itself and of me, and of the temporary way we had of seeing things. I blushed when I remembered it, and I remembered it constantly, blushes that lasted whole geological eras. To hide my shame, I crawled into the craters of the volcanoes. In remorse, I sank my teeth into the caps of the glaciations that covered the continents. I was tortured by the thought that Coic, always preceding me in the circumnavigation of the Milky Way, would see the sign before I could erase it. And bored that he was, he would mock me and make fun of me, contemptuously repeating the sign in rough caricatures in every corner of the circumgalactic sphere. Instead, this time, the complicated astral timekeeping was in my favor. Coig's constellation didn't encounter the sign, whereas our solar system turned up there punctually at the end of the first revolution, so close that I was able to erase the whole thing with the greatest care. Now, there wasn't a single sign of mine in space. I could start drawing another, but I knew that signs allow others to judge the one who makes them, and that in the course of a galactic year, tastes and ideas have time to change, and the way of regarding the earlier ones depends on what comes afterward. In short, I was afraid a sign that now might seem perfect to me in 200 or 600 million years would make me look absurd. Instead, in my nostalgia, the first sign, brutally rubbed out by Coic, remained beyond the attacks of time and its changes. The sign created before the beginning of forms, which was to contain something that would have survived all forms, namely the fact of being a sign, and nothing else. Making signs that weren't that sign no longer held any interest for me, and I had forgotten that sign now, billions of years before. So unable to make true signs, but wanting somehow to annoy Coic, I started making false signs, notches in space, holes, stains, little tricks that only an incompetent creature like Coic could mistake for signs. And still, he furiously got rid of them with his erasings, as I could see in later revolutions, with a determination that must have cost him much effort. Now I scattered these false signs liberally through space to see how far his simple-mindedness would go. Observing these erasures, one circuit after the next, the galaxy's revolutions had now become for me a slow, boring voyage without goal or expectation. I realized something. As the galactic years passed, the erasures tended to fade in space, and beneath them, what I had drawn at those points, my false signs, as I called them, began to reappear. This discovery, far from displeasing me, filled me with new hope. If Coic's erasures were erased, the first he had made there at that point must have disappeared by now, and my sign must have returned to its pristine visibility. So expectation was revived to lend anxiety to my days. The galaxy turned like an omelet in its heated pan, itself both frying pan and golden egg, and I was frying with it in my impatience. But with the passing of the galactic years, space was no longer that uniformly barren and colorless expanse. The idea of fixing with signs the points where we passed, as it had come to me and to Coic, had occurred to many, scattered over billions of planets of other solar systems, and I was constantly running into one of these things, or a pair or even a dozen simple two-dimensional scrolls or else three-dimensional solids, polyhedrons, for example, or even things constructed with more care, with the fourth dimension and everything. So it happened that I reached the point of my sign, and I found 5, all there. And I wasn't able to recognize my own. It's this one, no. That, no. That one seems too modern, but it could also be the most ancient. I don't recognize my hand in that one. I would never have wanted to make it like that. And meanwhile, the galaxy ran through space and left behind those signs, old and new. And I still hadn't found mine. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the galactic years that followed were the worst I had ever lived through. I went on looking, and the signs kept growing thicker in space. From all the worlds, anybody who had an opportunity invariably left his mark in space, somehow. And our world, too. Every time I turned, I found more crowded, so that the world and space seemed the mirror of each other, both minutely adorned with hieroglyphics and ideograms, each of which might be a sign and might not be. A calcareous concretion on basalt, a crest raised by the wind on the clotted sand of the desert, the arrangement of the eyes in a peacock's tail, gradually living among signs that led us to see signs in countless things that before were there, marking nothing but their own presence. They had been transformed into the sign of themselves, and had been added to the series of signs made on purpose by those who meant to make a sign. The fire streaks against a wall of schistose rock, the 427th groove, slightly crooked, of the cornice of a tomb's pediment, a sequence of streaks on a video during a thunderstorm. The series of signs was multiplied in the series of the signs of signs repeated countless times, always the same and always somehow different, because to the purposely made sign you had to add the sign that had happened there by chance. The badly inked tail of the letter R in an evening newspaper, joined to a thready imperfection in the paper, one among the 800,000 flakings of a tarred wall in the Melbourne docks, the curve of a graph, a skid mark on the asphalt, a chromosome. Every now and then I'd start, "That's the one!" And for a second, I was sure I had rediscovered my sign. On the Earth or in space, it made no difference, because through the signs a continuity had been established with no precise boundaries anymore. In the universe now, there was no longer a container and a thing contained, but only a general thickness of signs, superimposed and coagulated, occupying the whole volume of space. It was constantly being dotted, minutely, a network of lines and scratches and reliefs and engravings. The universe was scrolled over on all sides, all along its dimensions. There was no longer any way to establish a point of reference. The galaxy went on turning, but I could no longer count the revolutions. Any point could be the point of departure. Any sign heaped up with the others could be mine. But discovering it would have served no purpose, because it was clear that independent of signs, space didn't exist, and perhaps had never existed.